Hello, you're listening to Lobby Rants with The Lobbyist. Join us as we shed some light on the news, current affairs, and the exciting and complicated world of politics. It's crunch time in British politics. With only a few months left till our scheduled departure from the European Union in March 2019, Theresa May and her Brexit cabinet are desperate to finalise a deal that they believe would serve in the interests of the Brexiteers, the Jacob Rees-Moggs, the Boris Johnsons, and of course serve the interests of the Remainers, those who would like to stay as close as possible to the EU, or, as some like the Labour MP Chukwuemeka have called for, a people's vote. A yes or no vote from members of the public on the final Brexit deal. A vote that many now call a second referendum.
We've got something new here, which is a Brexit deal, which we will have at the end of the year. And I don't think that 650 politicians should be determining what we do on that for 65 million people. I think it's absolutely right that people should have a say on that Brexit deal. And that's what this cross-party campaign is all about.
It's sour grapes, isn't it?
The surest sign that a deal seems to be close is a change in rhetoric. It becomes more frightening. The warnings become more frank, the language more direct. For clear examples of this last-minute cutthroat negotiation strategy, one need not look any further than the DUP, whose message to the Tory party this week was do not take our support for granted.
I am a unionist. I believe in the union of the United Kingdom. But what happens in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years? We do not want Northern Ireland going off in a different direction from the rest of the UK, and that, to me, is fundamental.
One person who seems to have declared his support for the Prime Minister's negotiation strategy is none other than the father of the House, Ken Clarke.
Does she equally accept that the maths makes it obvious that that majority can only be obtained if the agreement retains the support of the pro-European Conservative backbenchers in this House and also wins the support of a significant number of Labour backbenchers, pro-European backbenchers on the other side of the House, which would reveal that the hardline Eurosceptic views of the Bennites on the Labour front bench and the right-wing nationalists in our party are a minority in this Parliament. Will she therefore proceed courageously on that basis in the formidable task that lies ahead of her?
It appears as though that the Brexit negotiations won't be the only hurdle Theresa May has to jump. The real test, the final test, will come from Parliament. Will they, like Ken Clarke, back her on the final deal, or will she be receiving yet another kick in the teeth? One person who is determined to disrupt the Brexit process in any way he can is none other than a former Minister of State for Education, the former Transport Secretary under Tony Blair. This is of course the Labour peer Lord Adonis, who I spoke to earlier this week about his views on Brexit and a second referendum. Lord Adonis, in an article by Politico, you're listed as one of 40 Brexit troublemakers. Do you agree with that description?
Well, I hope it's true, because it is true. I'm trying to make trouble for Brexit. But democratically, my view is that an issue as big as this, the people should have the choice when they see the actual deal, because 2 years ago, all we had was the side of a bus that said 350 million a week for the NHS. Remember when we were told that 7 million Turks were going to be invaded and so on. So a lot of assertions made. To be fair to the Leave side, they couldn't say what the Leave deal would be because none had been negotiated. So we were waiting for Theresa May to negotiate it. When she does, when we know what it's going to mean for trade, for jobs, for the exit fee we're going to have to pay to the EU, for what it means for EU residents who are living in this country and Brits who are resident in Europe, all of whom have freedom of movement and freedom to work and settle at the moment. When we know all that, then it should go to a people's vote and people should have the final say. Now, of course, I will be urging at that stage that much better than putting the country at risk and putting people's jobs and livelihoods at risk, much better than that is simply to stay in the EU. But we're a democracy, and I'm not seeking to impose that view. We'll have to decide collectively.
Yeah. So let's slow down a minute. Let's go back to the 23rd of June, 2016, the day after the EU referendum, when you woke up and you saw that 51% of the country had voted to leave the European Union. How did that make you feel as a passionate Remainer?
Well, I thought we were at the beginning of a very long process, because I know the European Union well. I've been in the cabinet, I've been very involved in politics. I knew it was going to be a hellishly difficult business to leave the EU. I mean, and what did leave mean? Because the problem is that the EU is a set of interlocking institutions. And what a lot of people were concerned about was sovereignty or freedom of movement, but there's also this thing called the customs union and the single market. And the customs union in particular is hugely significant to our trade because it means that trade can pass across barriers without customs checks and without tariffs. Now, that when you're a smallish trading nation like us, that's hugely important because trade is so important to our livelihoods, and we trade more than half our trade goes either to the EU or to countries with which the EU has trade agreements. So my thought on the day after the referendum was, well, this is now going to be a massive job of work to negotiate some agreement on leaving. Did
you already have plans for arguing for a second referendum?
No, at the time I didn't, because at the time I thought what Theresa May would do, because of course it took 2 months for Theresa May to become Prime Minister, so she wasn't really in harness until it was a month, until mid-July, but then it was August, so she didn't really get seriously going until September, October. I thought what she was going to do was what, in the language of that period, was called soft Brexit. Do you remember we were arguing about hard Brexit and soft Brexit? What I thought she would do, because after all, as you said, it was a 51% vote, and there were a lot of options, and since it was just a narrow majority, I thought what she would do would be to stay in the European Customs Union and the single market, but seek to limit freedom of movement, because immigration had been the big issue in the referendum campaign, and get us to a position quite similar to Switzerland and Norway, where we are part of the European economic institutions, but we don't do the full integration, and we have some special arrangements. I was astonished when it wasn't for another 6 months, it wasn't until January 2017 that Theresa May made this speech where she said that her red lines, so the minimum negotiating requirement for her, was that we should leave fully the customs union and the single market and have to start negotiating from scratch trade treaties with all of the countries of the European Union. It was at that point that I thought that the case for Brexit had become unsustainable, and I started myself taking a view against it. Until then, I thought we were going to end up in a position quite similar to Norway, what's called in the jargon the European Economic Area, which is a kind of lesser version of the European Union. It involves less integration, but does keep you in the same system as Europe for customs, tariffs, and a lot of your trade. So it's been a progressive thing over the last 2 years.
I'm just wondering, why do you find it so hard to accept the outcome of the EU referendum? Because lots of people listening to your arguments will say that this is just another example of the political class ignoring the will of the people. Isn't that right?
No, it's not correct at all, because the will of the people, as I see it in 2016, even the will of the 51%, so leave aside the 49% and the need to reach some accommodation with them, even taking the 51%, it's not at all clear to me on any reading of the propositions that were put forward and what people said themselves that they were voting to leave the European Customs Union and the single market. On the contrary, the polls after the EU referendum showed that 2/3 of the people who voted to leave thought we would stay in the Customs Union and the single market. They thought that we were basically not having any more freedom of movement, so there'd be less immigration. More than that, Boris Johnson, who was, insofar as there was a single biggest Leave campaigner, it was Boris Johnson, he said that we'd stay in the customs union and the single market in the referendum campaign. And the Conservative Party manifesto for the 2015 election, which was before the referendum, had said that in the event of us leaving the European Union, we'd stay in the customs union and the single market. Now, the big problem was that David Cameron called a referendum in 2016 without actually having a Leave proposition, because, as I've said, Leave could mean 10 different ways of leaving, all of which are radically different. What should have happened was that before we had the referendum, the people who wanted to leave should have had to publish their proposal for how we were going to leave, in the same way as political parties publish manifestos at elections. So that never happened. That's now effectively what's happening now.
Do you consider yourself Britain's saviour?
Well, do I consider myself? No, I think there's a big issue about whether the country at large can, before we crash out of the EU next March, whether we can revisit this decision on the basis of the actual proposal. I do believe that it's the biggest decision of this generation, and I do believe that the consequences of leaving for the country would be potentially catastrophic, and therefore it would be an act of national salvation for us to stay in the European Union. But this isn't about me personally, this is about the people at large.
I do want to talk about you just for a slight moment. The reason I asked if you consider yourself Britain's saviour was because you recently wrote a book called Saving Britain.
I didn't say that I would be saving Britain. I said that there was an opportunity for us collectively to save Britain. There's a big difference. I didn't say I am the saviour of Britain. I'm not a kind of megalomaniac.
Okay. But you would accept the premise that arguments make a person. A person's views is what makes a person.
I think, was it Pascal? I think, therefore I am.
Descartes.
I think, therefore I am. Yes, I do believe that people's views are what they are. Yes, I do believe that.
So there are some people, Chuka Umunna, who want a second referendum. Putting aside your arguments, why should people get behind your views?
Because they'll be able to see the deal that Theresa May reaches. So it's not going to be my views. I mean, though I will set out views, I think people will reach their own judgment when they see it. In the analogy I use a lot now, because I'm in Northern Ireland a lot, there's one of the arguments for not Brexiting is that it will involve more border arrangements between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which I think will be a very bad thing for the peace process in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland had a referendum 20 years ago on the Good Friday Agreement, which was the big and very controversial agreement that ended the what had been 30 years of terrorism. When the Northern Ireland Agreement was signed in 1998 by Tony Blair, when he was Prime Minister, it went to a referendum, and a copy of the Northern Ireland Agreement was sent to every voter in Northern Ireland. And it's a 30-page document. It's quite a detailed thing. Now, my view is if a copy of the Good Friday Agreement, which was of central importance to the people of Northern Ireland, if that could be sent to them and they were mature enough to make a decision based upon reading it, we should do the same with Theresa May's deal for leaving the EU. That when she's got that deal, we still haven't got it, but when she's got it sometime between now and Christmas, a copy should be sent to every voter across the United Kingdom, because this is the most important decision that this country will take in the next generation, whether we stay in the European Union or leave it. And they should be then given the power through a referendum to make the decision themselves.
Okay. One more question about you. You grew up in Kerr, didn't you?
Yeah.
Do you think that experience, your childhood, has somewhat equipped you, prepared you for the backlash you face from your views on a second referendum?
Actually, I don't think that. No, what equipped me for dealing with controversies of being in politics is I've now been in politics for the best part of 20 years. So actually, when I was not much older than you. How old are you? Are you 20?
18.
18. Well, when I was 23, so a bit older than you, I got elected as a councillor. Indeed, I fought my first election to be a councillor at the age of 22, and I was an agent for a candidate at the age of 21. So I got involved in politics very young, and when you first go into politics and you get into controversial situations, because of course as soon as you start expressing views in politics, people disagree with you, and sometimes they disagree with you violently. It became a big shock. I thought when I was being criticised and people were writing letters to the paper saying how I was a very bad thing, that I took it all very personally. What it took me a time to learn was that in a society like ours, which is a democracy, people do have different views. That's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. I mean, countries where everyone has the same view, they tend to be either dictatorships or they're countries which have very immature democracies where there isn't wide public debate. Now, clearly, this issue of whether Britain is in Europe or not in Europe is hugely divisive in society. It's not just now. It was in the 1970s when we went in, and it has been go back a century, this issue about whether we should be more closely engaged in Europe or should stand apart. After it was one of the big issues in the 1930s about whether we should start taking on Germany. It was essentially the same issue. There are going to be very strong views on it. I don't take it personally. I mean, I do debates with Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nigel Farage, and we go for each other, hammer and tongs, I mean, in a debating way, rather like our debate here this evening. And that is what democracy is all about.
Okay. So, very briefly, can you give us the moral and democratic justification for a second referendum?
The people should decide whether, when they see the withdrawal deal that Theresa May negotiates, because no one's seen it yet, when they see it, the people should decide whether they want it or whether they want to do any other thing that's viable and practical, which is to stay in the EU.
So, there's 169 days left till Brexit. If there's no people's vote, no second referendum, are you going to lay down your sword and accept that Britain is leaving the EU?
Well, Parliament will have to make a decision. See, we're not a dictatorship where the government can rule by decree. So when the Prime Minister negotiates her treaty, what is going to happen is that treaty is going to go to Parliament. Now, she doesn't have a majority in the House of Commons at the moment. She has one group of her MPs around Jacob Rees-Mogg called the European Reform Group, who are against any form of treaty that involves any role for the European Court of Justice and any continuing engagement in a customs union. It's very likely they're going to vote against it. She has people who are more of my persuasion on the moderate wing of the Conservative Party who think that it's still a mistake. Indeed, they think it's a bigger mistake now to leave the European Union than they did 2 years ago, because now we can see the terms. They think they're much worse than we expected. So it looks to me as if she's going to have very, very great difficulty getting her withdrawal agreement through Parliament, which is our proper democratic process. The issue of the people's vote is a subsidiary question, because the issue of the people's vote is if Parliament decides it doesn't like this treaty, is it just going to say, OK, we're not having it, which it has the legal and democratic power to do, because it is the sovereign power, democratic power in Britain, is Parliament, or is it going to take what I think is a better decision, because of the gravity of the issue and the level of public debate and concern there is about it, which is not just to take the decision itself, but to refer it to a people's vote. I think that would be more democratic in my view, and that's the justification for it.
Come March 2019, if Theresa May does get her withdrawal agreements passed, are you going to stop campaigning for a second referendum?
I'm certainly not going to campaign. Well, by then it'll be too late to campaign for a second referendum to stay in, because we will be leaving. Do I think once we've left that there'll be a big argument for going back in again? I'm not sure is the answer. I think a lot depends upon the circumstances. You know, if we do Brexit next March, does it work or not? I certainly think that if we Brexit next March, we've got to give it a go. We should do our best to see whether it can be made to work. It's my view that it probably can't be, but we can't keep revisiting this every year. So there'll be a period, I don't know what the period will be, when I suspect there'll be a kind of truce on Europe. And those people like me who think that the right thing for us to be is in the European Union will just watch and wait and see what happens. And then one or two things will happen. If it's a success, I suspect that that's game over. If Brexit is a success, then there's no reason why we would reapply to join. If, however, those of us who are very critical of it are proved right and it's a big failure and we start losing national income, jobs, wealth, influence in Europe and all of that as a result, then I doubt that this issue is going to go away.
Lord Adonis, thank you.
Thank you. That was good. Well done.
What really stood out from my interview with Lord Adonis was a willingness to accept defeat. Despite his political stature, despite having spent the last 2 years trying to reverse Brexit, come March 2019, when we finally leave the European Union, Lord Adonis seems ready to lay down his sword. All of this begs the question: if a passionate Remoaner like Lord Adonis accepts the fate of Brexit, can we expect to see a similar result from the hardline Brexiteers? Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear other episodes, all you have to do is type up Lobby Rants into your podcast app. If you really enjoyed what we had to say, subscribe and leave us a rating. I'm Kafurio Patter, the editor of The Lobbyist, and from all of us at The Lobbyist, have a lovely week.